In the hours before dawn on February 24, 2022, while most of Europe slept under a quiet winter sky, a different kind of silence stretched across the Kremlin's long corridors as Vladimir Putin finalized the decision that would instantly reshape the continent. The order had already been drafted, sealed, and rehearsed in the shadows for weeks, but that night carried a heaviness that no briefing or map or intelligence summary could lighten. And as the clock crept closer to 5 a.m., in Moscow, Putin delivered the address that echoed across millions of screens, announcing what he described as a special military operation in Ukraine, a phrase that, within minutes, would translate into explosions lighting up the skyline of Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, and dozens of military installations scattered across the country. And while the speech ended in a tone of cold finality, its consequences were only beginning to take shape on the ground, where Ukrainian border posts crackled with confused radio chatter, commanders barked hurried orders, and families across the country awoke to a low rumble that grew louder, closer, and unmistakably hostile. In Kiev, the first blast shattered the morning calm, rattling windows and sending crowds rushing down apartment stairwells into underground shelters, some still clutching blankets, others holding pets, documents, and half-packed bags, while across the river the city's air defense crews scrambled to man their stations, struggling to make sense of the incoming wave of missiles streaking through the sky. In Moscow, meanwhile, the decision had been framed by Putin and his closest circle as a strategic gamble, one intended to reshape regional power, secure borders, and force geopolitical acceptance of Russia's demands. But outside that insulated bubble, along the long and frozen front lines stretching from Belarus to Crimea, soldiers on both sides were coming face to face with the raw, unpredictable reality war. Russian units moved first, crossing into Ukraine under a dark horizon lit only by their own headlights, armored columns rumbling forward in tightly packed formations, unaware that within days many of those same vehicles would litter the roads as burnt skeletons, testimony to just how fiercely the Ukrainians would resist. Yet in the first hours, momentum appeared firmly on Russia's side, with airborne troops landing near Hostomel airport in an ambitious attempt to seize a critical gateway to Kiev, a bold thrust designed to break the capital's defenses quickly. But the Guard, dug in and determined, responded with relentless fire, turning the airfield into a brutal battleground of smoke, shrapnel, and shattered plans. Across the country, civilians began to send frantic messages to relatives abroad, sharing photos of fireballs rising over fuel depots, videos of long queues forming at ATM and gas stations, and the strange, unreal emptiness of highways where thousands were now fleeing west, their cars forming endless lines stretching toward Lviv and beyond, headlights glowing like a trail of fear across the landscape. In Russia, reactions varied. Expressed support, others disbelief, and still others confusion as social media filled with clips of tanks crossing borders and jets streaking overhead, images that felt surreal even to those who had anticipated conflict for months. But for Putin, the gamble was moving exactly as planned in those initial hours, his intelligence briefings reporting swift advances and limited resistance, though this confidence would soon collide with the stark reality of Ukrainian resilience. In Kharkiv, fierce firefights erupted as Russian units attempted to push into the city, only to face barricaded streets, Molotov cocktails raining from apartment balconies, and defenders who knew every inch of their neighborhoods. In the south, the situation shifted more quickly, with Russian forces moving out of Crimea and capturing key positions, their progress slowed only by blown bridges and ambushes, narrow choke points where Ukrainian troops fought with desperate determination. Yet the human cost mounted on both sides. Young conscripts who had expected training exercises found themselves under real fire, civilians caught in crossfire while trying to escape, and medics struggling to treat injuries as sirens echoed through shattered towns. All the while, global reactions poured in with remarkable speed, sanctions hitting Russia within hours, world leaders condemning the invasion, and journalists broadcasting live from streets trembling under artillery impacts, their voices steady Even as debris fell around them, as daylight broke fully on that first day, Kiev's skyline was veiled in a haze of smoke drifting from the outskirts where clashes intensified, and President Zelensky, appearing in a simple T-shirt on a shaky handheld video, stood with his officials and declared that Ukraine would not flee, a message that galvanized millions watching across the world. But inside Russian military headquarters, analysts began to notice the early signs that the operation, though vast in scale, would not unfold as smoothly as initially projected, with logistical delays, unexpectedly strong resistance, and morale issues forming cracks beneath the surface. Yet, even with these complications, Putin remained resolute, convinced that overwhelming pressure would eventually force negotiations on his terms. Meanwhile, in the cramped shelters beneath Kiev's subway stations, families listened to the thud of distant detonations, holding their breath after each blast, unsure if the next one would land closer, children asking questions their parents couldn't answer, elderly clutching radios tuned to constant updates, and volunteers distributing water and blankets while trying to mask their own fear. Across the border in Russian towns near Ukraine, families of soldiers watched televised reports filled with confident rhetoric, unaware that some of the units shown on screen were already engaged in chaotic firefights or caught in ambushes that would never be publicly acknowledged. And as night returned on the first day of the invasion, the world had shifted irrevocably. Maps were redrawn not by diplomacy, but by crater marks and troop movements. Cities once bustling with life now cloaked in darkness due to power outages. The roads filled with exhausted refugees, sleeping in cars, and the airwaves saturated with the relentless hum of breaking news. All while Putin met again with his inner circle, reviewing the first day's outcomes with a calm exterior masking the enormity of the risks he had taken. For him, the invasion was a calculated move shaped by years of geopolitical tension, NATO expansion fears, and unresolved disputes dating back to the Soviet collapse. But for millions on both sides of the border, it was something far simpler and far more devastating. The moment life split into two eras, before the war and after, a day when ordinary people became unwilling participants in an unfolding chapter of history, when soldiers who had never met suddenly became enemies, and when the echo of a single decision made in Moscow traveled across farms, suburbs, forests, and cities in Ukraine, leaving a trail of uncertainty, courage, grief, and resistance that would continue long after that first sunrise gave way to the bitter cold of night, marking the end of the first day of Putin's gamble. A gamble whose consequences would ripple far beyond the borders where its opening strikes had fallen.